The warm September sun cast a golden glow over the Wilson family as they unloaded the last of their boxes into their new home. The air was filled with the sense of freshly cut grass and the faint hum of distant lawnmowers. A peaceful backdrop to what they hoped would be a new, brighter chapter in their lives. James Wilson set down a box labeled kitchen and took a moment to survey their new house, a cozy, two-story home nestled in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. There was something satisfying about the sight, the white shutters against the brick exterior. The wide porch that seemed to promise long, lazy evenings. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs. The home represented years of sacrifice, late nights, and skipped vacations. Each dollar carefully saved to give their daughter, Lionel, the best life possible. James glanced over his shoulder at Lionel, who was carrying her own box, her thin arms struggling under its weight. She was only 13 but already carried herself with a quiet grace that both he and his wife, Maria, admired. They had taken this leap, moving to a new city, uprooting their lives, hoping it would open doors for her, provide her with opportunities they never had. Riverside Academy, her new school, was known throughout the city for its academic rigor and prestigious reputation. It was the kind of place where parents dreamt of sending their children, a gateway to a future filled with possibilities. Lionel paused in the doorway, her eyes scanning the house. She gave a shy, hopeful smile, one that faded too quickly. James recognized the flicker of anxiety beneath it. Lionel had always been more comfortable with books than with new faces, and though she tried to keep her worries hidden, he saw the faint shadow of fear in her gaze. Moving was thrilling. Yes, but also daunting. Do you think she's really excited? Maria asked softly, sidling up next to him. Her gaze was warm and hopeful, her voice a soft encouragement. She seems a little nervous. James nodded. She'll be okay. It's just the first day jitters. This school is going to be good for her. Later that evening, as the family gathered around the small dining table for their first dinner in the new home, the conversation turned to Lionel's upcoming first day at Riverside. The table was set simply, with takeout containers from the local Chinese restaurant stacked next to mismatched plates they'd yet to unpack. But the air was thick with unspoken hopes and worries. Riverside is a big change, honey, Maria said gently, reaching across the table to squeeze Lionel's hand. But remember, it's full of new possibilities too. New friends, new experiences. Lionel nodded, her face betraying a mix of excitement and apprehension. I know, Mom. It's just everything's so different here. Her voice was small, uncertain, and she looked down, twisting her fingers together in her lap. James felt a pang of protectiveness. You've got this, sweetheart, he said with a warm smile. Just be yourself. People are going to see how special you are. Lionel returned his smile, her face brightening for a moment. Thanks, Dad, she murmured, her gaze flicking between her parents as if drawing strength from them. After dinner, Lionel slipped quietly into her room. She carefully unpacked her new notebooks, lined them up neatly on her desk, and sharpened her pencils to precise points. It was her way of finding control in the unknown, creating order out of the uncertainty swirling around her. She stared at her school uniform laid out for the morning, a crisp navy blazer, white blouse, and pleated skirt, all pristine, unfamiliar. As she sat on her bed, the weight of her parents' expectations hung heavy around her. They had sacrificed so much, given up so many comforts, to bring her here. And now, it was up to her to make it worth it. She wanted to prove to them, and to herself, that she could succeed, that she belonged. The night was silent as Lionel lay awake, staring at the shadows dancing on her ceiling. Her mind raced with the unknowns that awaited her in the morning, the vast hallways of Riverside, the sea of new faces, the weight of expectation. She whispered into the quiet, as if to reassure herself. I can do this. I have to. In the room next door, James lay awake too, his mind turning over with equal parts pride and worry. He wanted nothing more than to see his daughter thrive, to watch her dreams blossom in this new chapter. But as he lay there, staring into the dark, he felt an unease creeping in. Riverside was everything they had hoped for, but was it everything Lionel needed? Only time would tell. Lionel gripped the strap of her backpack tightly as she stepped out of the car, her stomach a bundle of knots. Riverside Academy loomed before her, a majestic old building surrounded by sprawling lawns and ivy-covered stone walls that seemed to whisper of tradition and prestige. Students milled around the entrance in their neat, pressed uniforms, moving with a confidence that made her feel small and out of place. James and Maria exchanged an encouraging glance before James gave Lionel's shoulder a gentle squeeze. You're going to be amazing, sweetheart, he whispered. She managed a small smile in return, hoping it looked braver than she felt. With a final wave, her parents drove off, leaving her to face the day alone. Lyanna took a deep breath and stepped toward the entrance, each step echoing louder in her ears. Inside, the halls were immaculate, lined with rows of lockers and framed photos of past graduating classes. Students brushed past her in groups, talking and laughing as if they had known each other for years. No one stopped to look at her, no one smiled or offered to help her find her way. It was as though she was invisible. Her first class was history, and she entered the room cautiously, glancing around for a friendly face. The teacher, Mrs. Lin, greeted her with a polite nod but didn't make any introduction to the class. Lyanna found an empty seat near the back, her heart pounding as she set her bag down. She glanced at the other students, hoping for a hint of warmth or friendliness. But they were engrossed in their conversations, oblivious to the new girl. As the teacher began her lecture, Lyanna tried to focus, but she could feel the curious stares of her classmates on her. She kept her gaze fixed on her notebook, her hand shaking slightly as she took notes, desperate not to draw any more attention to herself. When the bell rang, Lyanna followed the crowd into the hallway, her gaze darting from classroom doors to room numbers as she searched for her next class. She felt like an outsider, wandering through a maze where everyone seemed to know the rules but her. At lunch, she cautiously approached a group of girls sitting around a table, chatting animatedly. She offered them a tentative smile, hoping they might invite her to join. But as she stood there, waiting for a friendly nod, they glanced up, their eyes skimming over her as if she were barely worth noticing. Before turning back to their conversation without a word, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She turned away, clutching her lunch tray tightly, and found an empty seat in the corner of the cafeteria, where she ate in silence, the sounds of laughter and chatter filling the air around her, painfully out of reach. By the time the school day ended, Lyanna felt drained, both physically and emotionally. She walked out of the school, her shoulders slumped and her heart heavy. When she spotted her parents' car parked at the curb, she forced a smile, determined to hide the loneliness that clung to her like a shadow. "So, how was your first day?" Maria asked eagerly as Lyanna slid into the back seat. "It was okay," Lyanna replied, shrugging. "A little overwhelming, I guess. Just new." She paused, searching for the right words. "I'm sure it'll get better." Maria beamed, clearly reassured, and James glanced at her in the rearview mirror with a proud smile. "That's the spirit," he said. "New places take time. You'll settle in soon." Lyanna nodded, but as she looked out the window, her heart felt heavy. She wanted to believe them, to think that tomorrow would be better, that she would find her place at Riverside. But deep down, a part of her wondered if she would always feel like a stranger here, invisible in a sea of unfamiliar faces. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Lyanna sat in her room, her thoughts swirling. She had imagined Riverside as a place where she would grow, where she'd meet people who saw her for who she was. But after just one day, that dream already felt painfully out of reach. She closed her eyes, whispering into the quiet, "Tomorrow will be different. It has to be." The days at Riverside Academy blended into one another, each filled with the same unsettling mixture of hope and dread. Lyanna tried her best to adapt, to find a rhythm within the relentless tide of new faces and strict routines. But the feeling of being an outsider clung to her like a stubborn shadow. By the end of the first week, Lyanna was still struggling to connect with her classmates. She sat alone in the cafeteria, picking at her food while the sounds of laughter and chatter washed over her like an uninvited tide. Each passing day, she encountered whispered comments and furtive glances that sent her heart racing. They weren't outright insults yet, but the weight of exclusion felt heavy and suffocating. One afternoon, as she sat at her usual table in the far corner, a group of girls approached. They were the same ones she'd seen in her classes, giggling and whispering among themselves. Lyanna's heart quickened with a mix of anxiety and hope. Maybe they wanted to include her this time. "Hey, look who it is," one of the girls said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. The new girl. Her friends erupted into laughter. Lyanna forced a smile, hoping to brush it off. "Hi, I'm Lyanna," she said, trying to sound cheerful. The girl rolled her eyes. "We know who you are. You're the one who doesn't belong here." Lyanna's heart sank. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she looked down at her tray, wishing she could disappear. As the girls walked away, giggling, Lyanna felt the tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. She had promised herself she would be strong. She took a deep breath, trying to push away the feeling of humiliation that settled in her chest like a stone. The following week, things only seemed to escalate. In gym class, Lionel struggled with the drills, her lack of confidence showing as she tripped over her own feet. Her classmates laughed at her mistakes, their mockery echoing off the gym walls. "Come on, Lionel. Are you even trying?" one boy called out, his voice mocking. The laughter that followed cut deeper than any physical blow could. The bruises on her body were easier to explain than those on her spirit. She returned home each day, her heart heavy, but she brushed off her parents' concerns. "I'm just clumsy," she would say, offering them a weak smile. Nothing to worry about. Yet as the weeks dragged on, the bruises multiplied. And so did her exhaustion. Each encounter with her classmates drained her more than the last. They were small acts of cruelty, pushing her aside in the hall, hiding her backpack, whispering insults when they thought she couldn't hear. It felt like the entire school was a web of silent judgments. And she was the fly caught in it, struggling to break free. One day, during lunch, as she tried to find a spot to sit, a group of girls occupied the only empty table. They looked up at her with disdain. "Sorry. This seat is taken," one said with a smirk, not even bothering to move her tray. Lionel stood frozen, her face burning with embarrassment. She glanced around, searching for another option. But every table was full. The cafeteria felt like a cage, and the walls seemed to close in on her as she turned and walked back to the far corner. As she sat alone, the laughter of her peers echoed around her, each giggle and whispered comment feeling like a stab to her already bruised heart. She picked at her food, feeling the weight of isolation press down on her shoulders. In her mind, Lionel replayed her parents' words about new beginnings and hope, but all she felt was despair. The dreams she had harbored about this school, the friendships, the experiences, seemed so far away, overshadowed by the relentless cycle of bullying that was consuming her spirit. That night, after dinner, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the tears finally spilling over. She felt so alone. "Why is it so hard?" she whispered into the darkness. "Why can't I just fit in?" Her heart ached as she realized that she was slipping further away from the vibrant girl she had once been. She wanted to be brave, to stand up to the torment. But each day felt like a battle. And she was losing. Little did she know, her parents were beginning to notice the changes in her. The spark in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by a heaviness that worried them both. They could sense something was wrong but didn't know how to reach her. As she drifted into a restless sleep, Lionel knew she had to find a way to rise above the pain. But with each passing day, she felt her strength waning, and the thought of facing another morning at Riverside filled her with dread. The shadows were closing in, and she could only hope for the dawn of a new day to break the darkness that had settled in her heart. Lionel's days at Riverside Academy became a blur of fear and isolation, each one echoing the last. The initial thrill of a new school had morphed into a monotonous cycle of torment. She woke each morning with a heavy heart, the prospect of facing her classmates filling her with dread. The whispers followed her like a haunting melody, a constant reminder that she was an outsider. It wasn't just the emotional wounds that troubled her, bruises began to mar her skin, each one a silent testament to the bullying she was enduring. A shove in the hallway here, a thrown ball that landed too hard there, each incident left its mark. She told herself they were just accidents, the result of clumsiness or bad luck. But deep down, she knew the truth. The pain was intentional. One chilly Wednesday afternoon, Lionel found herself sitting in the nurse's office. Her stomach churned with anxiety as she glanced at the clock, counting down the minutes until she could leave. A light tap on the door startled her, and Mrs. Collins, the school nurse, entered with a concerned expression. "Lionel, dear, how are you feeling?" Mrs. Collins asked, her voice gentle. "I'm fine," Lionel replied quickly, her gaze dropping to the floor. She didn't want to draw attention to the bruise blooming on her arm, a dark purple against her caramel skin. The nurse studied her for a moment, her brow furrowing. "You know, it's okay to talk about it if you're not feeling well," she said softly. "You can trust me." Lionel bit her lip, fighting back tears. She longed to confide in someone, to let out the truth that felt like it was choking her. But the fear of being seen as weak held her back. "I just bumped my arm during gym," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mrs. Collins nodded slowly, but Lionel could see the concern etched on her face. "All right, but remember, my door is always open." As Lionel left the office, the weight of her secret felt heavier than ever. She wanted to be brave like her parents believed her to be, but every day at school chipped away at her resolve, leaving her feeling hollow. When she returned home that evening, James and Maria greeted her with their usual enthusiasm, eager to hear about her day. But as they sat around the dinner table, Lionel could feel the tension in the air. The way her parents exchanged worried glances. "How was school today, honey?" Maria asked, her voice laced with a subtle urgency. "It was fine," Lionel replied, her fork pushing her peas around her plate. "Just school stuff." James leaned in. Concern etched across his brow. "Are you sure? You've seemed a little tired lately." Lionel shrugged, forcing a smile. "I'm just adjusting, Dad. It's a lot of new information." Maria studied her daughter closely, her maternal instinct screaming that something was amiss. "If anything's bothering you, you can tell us, sweetheart. We're here for you." "I know, Mom. Really, I'm okay," Lionel said, her voice almost pleading. "I just need time to settle in." As dinner continued, Lionel maintained the facade of normalcy. But inside, she was crumbling. The weight of her parents' concern felt like a suffocating blanket, one she didn't know how to shake off. The small bruises she passed off as accidents were piling up, and the guilt of lying to her parents gnawed at her conscience. The following days were a painful repetition. In gym class, the bullying escalated. As the teacher turned her back, a group of boys began to taunt her, throwing paper balls at her and laughing as she flinched each time one landed near her. The girls, once merely indifferent, now joined in, snickering at her expense. "Look at her. Can't even catch a ball," one of them shouted. And the others erupted in laughter. Lionel's heart raced as she fought back tears. But she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Instead, she picked up the paper balls scattered around her feet and walked away, her cheeks burning with humiliation. After class, she found herself alone in the restroom, staring at her reflection. The bruises on her arms and the tear stains on her cheeks told a story she didn't know how to share. She splashed cold water on her face, hoping it would wash away the hurt. But the emotional scars remained. Each night, she returned home with her heart heavy, carrying the weight of her silence. She crafted excuses for the bruises, blaming them on clumsiness or mishaps during gym. "I tripped over my shoelaces," she'd say, brushing off her parents' worried looks. But as the weeks turned into a month, the lies began to unravel. Lionel's spark had dimmed, and her conversations with her parents grew shorter, more strained. The once vibrant girl who spoke of art and dreams now sat in silence, retreating further into herself. One evening, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the gravity of her situation crashed over her. The weight of pretending was suffocating. She closed her eyes, wishing she could find the strength to speak up, to tell her parents what was really happening. But fear held her captive, a prison of her own making. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered into the dark, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I just want to be free." Little did she know that her parents were growing more concerned by the day. James and Maria exchanged hushed conversations, debating whether to confront her again or give her more space. But deep down, they both sensed that something was terribly wrong. As Lionel drifted into an uneasy sleep, she could only hope for a tomorrow that would bring change, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find her voice amidst the chaos that had become her life. With each passing day, the shadows of loneliness loomed larger around Lionel, threatening to engulf her entirely. The halls of Riverside Academy, once filled with promise, had become a battleground, a stark reminder of her isolation. The whispers and giggles followed her like a haunting echo, growing bolder as the weeks went on. It was as if the students had rallied together to ensure she understood just how unwelcome she was. In her history class, the teasing had turned to outright hostility. One morning, as she attempted to engage in a discussion, a boy named Kyle cut her off. "What do you know about history? You can't even keep your feet under you," he sneered, causing a ripple of laughter to pass through the room. Lionel felt her face flush with humiliation, the heat spreading from her cheeks to the tips of her fingers. She looked down, her voice choking in her throat, as the rest of the class continued to snicker. During gym class, the taunts transformed into physical harassment. As they lined up for a game of dodgeball, she felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in her stomach. It was her worst nightmare realized when a girl named Sarah intentionally aimed for her. The ball struck Lionel hard in the shoulder, and the laughter that erupted around her felt like daggers piercing her already fragile spirit. "Nice try, new girl," Sarah shouted, her voice dripping with derision. "Maybe next time, dodge the ball instead of just standing there." Lionel tried to laugh it off, but the weight of their laughter felt unbearable. She focused on her breathing, but the tears threatened to spill over. After class, she found a quiet corner of the school where she could escape the jeers and sneers. allowing herself a moment to breathe. The world around her faded into a blur as she wrapped her arms around her knees, wishing she could disappear entirely. As the days rolled into weeks, the physical bruises on her arms became harder to hide. She wore long sleeves even in the warmest weather, crafting excuses for her parents whenever they inquired about the marks. "Just a scrape from gym class," she would say, forcing a smile that felt more like a mask than a reflection of her true self. James and Maria accepted her words, but each time they glanced at her, their concern deepened. They could sense her withdrawal but didn't know how to penetrate the walls she had built around herself. At home, Lyanna often retreated to her room immediately after dinner. She buried herself in books, hoping to lose herself in their pages and forget the pain that awaited her each day. The quiet of her room became her sanctuary, but it also deepened her isolation. The stories she read filled her with a temporary escape, but they couldn't shield her from the reality she faced at school. One Friday night, while curled up on her bed, Lyanna overheard her parents talking in hushed tones in the living room. "I just don't understand," Maria said, her voice filled with worry. She used to be so vibrant, so full of life. Now she just retreats into herself. "Maybe we should talk to her school counselor," James suggested. "Something isn't right, and I can feel it. I can't just sit here and watch her suffer." Lyanna's heart sank. She knew her parents were worried, but the thought of opening up about her struggles was terrifying. What if they didn't believe her? What if they thought she was weak? The fear of their disappointment loomed larger than the pain she was experiencing. The next day, as she prepared for another week of school, Lyanna caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. The girl staring back at her looked worn and weary, shadows under her eyes betraying the sleepless nights filled with worry and despair. She had always prided herself on her strength, but now she felt like a shell of the person she once was. At school, the atmosphere had shifted. It felt like the entire student body had been given a green light to attack. During lunch, she found herself cornered by Sarah and her group of friends. They blocked her path as she attempted to walk to an empty table, their laughter echoing off the cafeteria walls. "Look, it's the loser. What are you going to do? Sit alone again?" Sarah taunted, and the group erupted into laughter once more. Lyanna tried to sidestep them, her heart racing as she felt their eyes boring into her. But they weren't done. As she turned to leave, one of the boys shoved her hard enough to send her sprawling onto the floor, her tray flying out of her hands, food splattering everywhere. The laughter that followed felt like an avalanche crashing over her. She scrambled to her feet, her cheeks burning with humiliation as she hurried away, tears streaming down her face. The cafeteria felt like a trap, the very air around her thick with the weight of their scorn. As she reached the safety of the restroom, Lyanna leaned against the sink, staring at her reflection. She was trembling, anger and humiliation swirling within her. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but instead, she felt utterly helpless. "Why can't I just fit in?" she whispered to herself, her voice cracking. "Why does it have to be like this?" For the first time, the reality of her situation hit her with a ferocity that left her breathless. She was sinking into a pit of despair, and every day felt like a fight for survival. The loneliness wrapped around her like a thick fog, making it hard to see the light. As she returned home that evening, the weight of her experiences felt like an anchor dragging her down. She forced herself to smile at her parents, but the act felt hollow. The gap between her and her family widened with each passing day, and she feared that soon she wouldn't be able to bridge it. That night, as she lay in bed, she realized that the fear of being seen as weak was slowly consuming her. But beneath that fear, a flicker of defiance began to stir. She had survived this long, hadn't she? And maybe, just maybe, it was time to reclaim her voice. With that thought lingering in her mind, she closed her eyes, summoning the strength she had thought lost. Tomorrow would be a new day, and perhaps it was time to fight back against the darkness that threatened to engulf her. It was time to rise. The air in the gymnasium was thick with anticipation as Lyanna stood among her classmates, feeling as out of place as ever. The school's annual Spirit Week had arrived, and everyone seemed to be buzzing with excitement. Banners hung from the rafters, colorful posters decorated the walls, and students sported their school colors. A vibrant display of camaraderie. Yet, for Lyanna, the celebration felt like a distant echo, a world she could only watch from the sidelines. As the dodgeball game commenced, the gym teacher, Mr. Harris, called for participants to divide into teams. Lyanna's heart sank as she realized that Sarah and her friends were among those chosen. She felt a knot of anxiety twist in her stomach, knowing they would be looking for any opportunity to humiliate her in front of the entire class. Let's show the new girl what Riverside's all about," Sarah shouted, eliciting laughter from her friends. The other students, caught in the infectious spirit of competition, didn't seem to notice, or care, that Lionel was standing just a few feet away, her heart racing as the taunts began to swirl around her. As the game began, Lionel braced herself for the inevitable. She tried to stay in the background, hoping to remain unnoticed. But Sarah had other plans. With a gleeful glint in her eye, she positioned herself to target Lionel. "Get ready to dodge, loser," Sarah yelled, her voice carrying through the gym as she prepared to throw the ball with all her might. Lionel's instincts kicked in, and she ducked just in time, feeling the rush of air as the ball whizzed past her. Relief washed over her momentarily. But as she looked up, she saw Sarah glaring at her, her frustration morphing into fury. "Not so fast," Sarah shouted. And without warning, she launched another ball straight at Lionel. This time, it struck her square in the chest, knocking the breath out of her. The force of it sent her stumbling back, and the laughter that erupted around her felt like a crushing weight. Lionel's face burned with shame as she gasped for air, fighting back tears. The room spun, and for a fleeting moment, she felt the urge to flee, to escape the humiliation that had become her daily existence. But instead, she forced herself to remain on the court, her heart pounding, determined not to let them see her break. "Come on, Lionel. Is that all you've got?" one of the boys jeered, egging on the crowd. That was it. Something inside her snapped. The torrent of anger and frustration she had bottled up surged to the surface, pushing away the fear that had held her captive for too long. She stood up straight, her heart racing not with fear, but with an unexpected fire. "I'm not a loser," she shouted, her voice louder than she had ever intended. The gym fell silent, all eyes turning to her in shock. "You think this is funny? You're pathetic." Gasps echoed through the gym as Lionel's words hung in the air. For a moment, she felt a rush of power, but it quickly faded as she realized the attention had shifted. The laughter had stopped, and she was now the focus of their scrutiny. Sarah's face twisted in disbelief before morphing into anger. "What did you just say?" she sneered, stepping closer, her friends flanking her like a pack of wolves. Lionel took a deep breath, her heart racing but her resolve hardening. "You think you can just bully me and get away with it? I'm tired of being treated like I don't matter." The tension in the gym was palpable as the two girls faced off, the rest of the students watching with bated breath. This was a moment Lionel had never imagined would come, and yet here she was, ready to stand her ground. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, Mr. Harris intervened, stepping between the two girls. "All right, that's enough," he boomed, his voice authoritative. "This is supposed to be a fun game, not a battlefield. Lionel, I appreciate you standing up for yourself, but let's keep this respectful." Lionel nodded, her heart still pounding as the gym teacher turned his attention to Sarah and her friends. "And you all need to remember that we do not tolerate bullying at this school. This is a place for respect and sportsmanship. Understood?" The crowd murmured in agreement, and for the first time, Lionel felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this moment would mark a turning point, not just for herself, but for the treatment she had endured for so long. As the game resumed, Lionel felt the weight of Sarah's glare but didn't allow it to break her spirit. Instead, she threw herself into the game, finding strength in the exhilaration of movement. She dodged, ducked, and even caught a few balls, each moment fueling her confidence. When the whistle blew to signal the end of the game, Lionel was breathless, not just from the exercise, but from the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The students slowly began to disperse, and she felt lighter, as if the burden she had carried for weeks had finally begun to lift. As she left the gym, she caught sight of Sarah watching her from a distance, her expression unreadable. But instead of fear, Lionel felt a surge of triumph. She had stood up for herself, and that was a victory in itself. The next day, however, would prove to be a greater challenge. The real battle was just beginning, and Lionel would need every ounce of courage she had found to face what lay ahead. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope, a belief that maybe she could reclaim her story. The aftermath of Lionel's stand in the gymnasium rippled through Riverside Academy like a shockwave. Whispers filled the hallways, and for the first time, she noticed that some students were looking at her differently. Curiosity, respect, perhaps even admiration flickered in their eyes. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. As she entered school the following day, she could feel the tension in the air. The chatter seemed to quiet as she walked by, the once harsh whispers transforming into hushed conversations. Lionel's heart raced, She wasn't sure whether this newfound attention was a blessing or a curse. Would it bring her relief? Or would it only intensify the bullying? In her first class, history, the teacher, Mrs. Lin, acknowledged the tension. Before we begin today, I want to remind everyone that we are a community. We stand together. And we treat each other with respect. Bullying will not be tolerated in this classroom, she said. Her gaze scanning the room, resting momentarily on Liana. Liana felt a rush of gratitude toward Mrs. Lin. It was the first time an adult had publicly addressed the issue since the torment had begun. But as she looked around, she noticed Sarah in the back. Her arms crossed and her expression dark. The confrontation in the gym had not gone unnoticed. And it was clear Sarah was plotting her next move. The rest of the day passed in a blur of classes, each one feeling charged with unspoken tension. Liana was hyper-aware of her surroundings, each glance from a classmate igniting a spark of anxiety. At lunch, she opted for her usual spot in the far corner, hoping to avoid any drama. But drama was precisely what she found. As she sat alone, picking at her food, she felt a presence looming nearby. Sarah approached with her friends in tow, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Liana's heart sank, she could sense the impending confrontation. "Nice little performance you had in gym class, Liana," Sarah said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But just because you yelled doesn't mean you've changed anything." Liana looked up, summoning every ounce of courage she had. "I'm not afraid of you, Sarah," she said firmly, her voice steadier than she felt. "You can't bully me anymore." Sarah laughed. But it was a hollow sound, lacking the confidence it once had. "Oh really? You think just because you shouted in front of everyone that it's over? Newsflash, it's not. You'll always be the outsider here." Liana felt her chest tighten. The anger she had felt yesterday began to bubble to the surface again. But she refused to let it show. "You can't keep hurting me just because you feel powerful," she retorted. "That says more about you than it does about me." The surrounding students were quiet. The cafeteria now a tense battleground. Sarah's friends exchanged glances, unsure how to react. Liana could feel the shift, she was no longer the only one standing. The support of her classmates was palpable, even if it was quiet. "Enough, Sarah," one of her friends finally said, stepping forward. "This is getting out of hand. You're not going to win anything by picking on her." Liana's heart swelled with gratitude. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this fight after all. But Sarah wasn't done yet. "You think this is over? Just wait until the principal hears about your little outburst," she sneered, her eyes narrowing. "I'll make sure you regret it." With that, Sarah spun on her heel, storming off with her entourage, leaving Liana shaken but resolute. The tension in the air was thick, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe standing up for herself was the first step toward reclaiming her life. However, the relief was short-lived. As the lunch period ended, Liana made her way to her locker, her mind racing with the potential fallout. Would Sarah actually go to the principal? Would she face more retaliation? As she opened her locker, her thoughts were interrupted by the unmistakable sound of laughter behind her. She turned to see a group of students from the cafeteria lingering nearby, their faces twisted in amusement as they pointed in her direction. The embarrassment rushed back, and she felt exposed, like a target. "Look, it's the brave girl," one boy called out mockingly, eliciting laughter from the others. Liana's stomach dropped. She knew she had stood up for herself, but in this moment, it felt like she was back at square one, the laughter piercing through her like shards of glass. Ignoring them, she closed her locker and walked away, head held high. But inside, the hurt seeped in. She wanted to confront them, to tell them how their laughter stung. But fear held her back. What if it only made things worse? When she arrived home that evening, the weight of the day's events crashed down on her. The thrill of standing up to Sarah had been quickly overshadowed by the reality of what came next. She sat on her bed, staring blankly at the wall, the echo of laughter still ringing in her ears. James and Maria were waiting for her in the living room, their expressions a mix of concern and encouragement. "How was school today?" James asked, trying to gauge her mood. "It was fine," Liana replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Maria glanced at her, sensing the tension. "You can talk to us. You know, if anything is bothering you." "I'm just tired," Liana interjected, not wanting to open that door. She wanted to be brave, to show them she could handle this on her own. But the weight of her silence was suffocating. As she retreated to her room, she felt a surge of frustration. Why couldn't she be brave all the time? Why did it feel like she was fighting a battle on two fronts, against her classmates and against her own fears? With determination, Lionel resolved to take control. She would go to the principal herself if it came to that. If Sarah wanted a fight, she would get one. The darkness that had haunted her for so long wouldn't win, not now. She was done hiding. As she lay in bed that night, she closed her eyes and whispered a silent vow: tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she would take a stand. Not just for herself, but for anyone else who felt powerless. With that thought in her mind, she drifted into a restless sleep, ready to face whatever came next. The following morning arrived with a heavy sky, clouds casting a gray pall over Riverside Academy. Lionel felt the familiar weight of anxiety settle in her chest as she prepared for school. The promise of a new day lingered on the horizon. But all she could think about was the impending confrontation with Sarah. What would happen when their paths crossed again? Would she have the strength to stand her ground? As she walked through the school gates, she steeled herself for the day ahead. The atmosphere felt charged, electric with the remnants of yesterday's drama. Students passed by her, some whispering and pointing, their eyes flickering with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. For the first time, she noticed that some seemed to look at her with respect, as if she had gained a newfound status simply by standing up to her bully. The first few classes were a blur, each minute dragging on as her mind replayed the events of the previous day. She tried to focus on the lessons, but her thoughts wandered, swirling around the uncertainty of what lay ahead. When the lunch bell rang, her heart raced. It was now or never. Lionel gathered her things, taking a deep breath as she joined the throng of students heading toward the cafeteria. She could feel the whispers before she even entered the room. As she stepped inside, she spotted Sarah sitting at her usual table, flanked by her friends, their laughter echoing like daggers. She hesitated at the door, battling the urge to turn and run. But then she remembered the support she had felt yesterday, the shift in the atmosphere, and her resolve hardened. With a quick inhale, she walked into the cafeteria, ignoring the stares and whispers that accompanied her. Finding an empty seat, she set her tray down, her hands trembling slightly as she took her place. Across the room, she noticed a couple of students who had seen her stand up to Sarah the day before. They were watching her with curious, supportive smiles. It was a small but powerful reminder that she wasn't entirely alone. As she began to eat, Sarah's voice sliced through the air, loud enough to carry over the hum of the cafeteria. "So, what's it like being the new girl who thinks she's tough?" she called out, a smirk dancing on her lips. "Are you really going to keep pretending like you belong here?" The laughter erupted from her table, and Lionel felt her heart drop. But instead of allowing the fear to paralyze her, something inside her stirred. She straightened her back and looked directly at Sarah. "I don't need to pretend," Lionel replied, her voice steady. "I know who I am, and that's enough for me." The words felt empowering, pouring out of her in a way she hadn't expected. A hush fell over the cafeteria as everyone turned to watch. Sarah's smirk faltered, and for a brief moment, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. But she quickly recovered, shooting back with a snide comment. "You'll see how quickly this school chews you up and spits you out." Lionel took a deep breath, trying to push through the tension. "Maybe," she said, her tone calm, "but I'd rather be myself than be like you." The tension in the air was palpable, and the room seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, the dynamics shifted. Sarah's laughter was replaced with murmurs of surprise from the surrounding students. Lionel's heart raced as she realized she had just stood up for herself again, this time with even more strength. As lunch continued, whispers turned to conversations among students, and Lionel felt a mix of exhilaration and fear. What would Sarah do next? Would she retaliate? Or had she underestimated the impact of Lionel's defiance? Later that afternoon, during math class, the teacher announced an unexpected pop quiz. The tension in the classroom was palpable as students scrambled to prepare. But Lionel found herself distracted, unable to shake the nerves of the cafeteria showdown. When the quiz was handed out, her mind raced. Questions swirled around. But as she tried to focus on the problems, the sound of laughter and whispers crept back in. Sarah's words echoed in her mind. And for a moment, she faltered, her thoughts slipping away from the task at hand. Just as she began to feel the weight of panic rise, she remembered the support she had felt earlier. She took a deep breath, recalling the students who had watched her with admiration, the small victories she had achieved. With renewed determination, she focused her gaze on the paper in front of her, pushing aside the distractions. She would not let fear dictate her actions any longer. After class, Lionel headed to her locker, the noise of students filling the hallway, She was just about to grab her books when she noticed a familiar face. It was Mia, one of the girls who had smiled at her during lunch. "Hey, Liana," Mia called, catching up to her. "That was really brave today. I was impressed." Liana's heart lifted at the compliment. "Thanks," she replied, a smile breaking through her nerves. "I'm just trying to stand up for myself." "You should definitely keep it up," Mia encouraged. "There are a lot of us who think you're cool. Just ignore the haters." Encouraged by Mia's words, Liana felt a warmth spreading through her chest. Maybe there was a chance to find a real friend in this new environment after all. As they walked together down the hallway, chatting about classes and shared interests, Liana felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, the tide was turning. That evening, as she sat down for dinner with her parents, Liana felt lighter. She shared snippets of her day, carefully omitting the harsher realities but focusing on the positive interactions she'd had. James and Maria exchanged proud glances, their concern slowly giving way to relief. "See? You're making progress," Maria said, her eyes sparkling with encouragement. "You're stronger than you realize." As Liana lay in bed that night, she reflected on the events of the day. There was still uncertainty ahead. She knew Sarah wouldn't back down easily, but she also felt a growing sense of resilience. She was ready to confront whatever came next. Tomorrow, she would continue to rise, to fight for her place in a world that had tried to silence her. With determination coursing through her, she closed her eyes, ready to embrace the challenges that awaited her. The road to healing wouldn't be easy, but she was no longer willing to hide in the shadows. She would face each day with courage, ready to reclaim her story. The morning after Liana's breakthrough felt different, charged with an energy that crackled in the air. As she stepped into Riverside Academy, the sun broke through the clouds, casting bright rays across the school grounds. Liana could feel a subtle shift around her. She was no longer the girl who cowered in the shadows. She was standing tall, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the day progressed, whispers of her confrontation with Sarah continued to circulate among the students. Many approached her in the halls, offering nods of encouragement or quiet words of support. Even those who had previously ignored her seemed to acknowledge her presence, and it filled her with a new sense of belonging. But that afternoon, as she walked toward her locker, she saw a familiar figure leaning against it. Sarah stood there, arms crossed, flanked by a couple of her friends. A familiar smirk tugged at her lips, and Liana felt a knot of tension tighten in her stomach. The confidence she had felt earlier began to waver. "Look who's suddenly brave," Sarah said, her voice laced with mockery. "What's it like to be the school's biggest joke?" Liana took a deep breath, refusing to let fear take hold. "I'm not afraid of you, Sarah. I've stood up to you before, and I'll do it again." "Oh really?" Sarah shot back, stepping closer. "You think your little outburst changed anything? You'll see what happens when you mess with me." Liana's heart raced, but she stood firm. "I'm not going to let you bully me anymore. This ends now." Just then, Mr. Harris walked by, his presence like a shield. He paused, sensing the tension. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice authoritative. "Just having a little chat," Sarah replied, her tone insincere. Mr. Harris's gaze shifted to Liana, and she could see the concern in his eyes. "Liana, if you're being harassed, I want you to let me know. We don't tolerate bullying at Riverside." Liana felt a rush of gratitude. "I will, Mr. Harris. I promise," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. As Mr. Harris continued down the hall, Liana turned to Sarah, her resolve unyielding. "You can't keep this up. You will face consequences for your actions." "Oh, I wouldn't be so sure about that," Sarah sneered. But Liana could see a flicker of uncertainty behind her bravado. After school, Liana's adrenaline surged. She needed to take action. She couldn't just wait for things to improve on their own. She needed to stand up for herself and for anyone else who felt powerless. With a newfound sense of determination, she decided to speak to Principal Sanders. When she arrived at the office, she took a moment to gather her thoughts. The walls felt like they were closing in as she stepped forward, but she pushed through the fear. Principal Sanders was sitting behind her desk, reviewing papers. "Liana, come in," she said warmly, gesturing for her to take a seat. "What can I do for you today?" Taking a deep breath, Liana began to share her experiences, the bullying, the harassment, and her confrontation with Sarah. As she spoke, she felt the weight of her silence begin to lift. Each word released a bit of the pain she had been carrying, and she could see Principal Sanders' expression change from casual interest to serious concern. "I'm so sorry to hear this," Lionel, Principal Sanders said, her tone empathetic. You're very brave for coming to me. I assure you, we will take this matter seriously. Lionel felt a wave of relief wash over her. I just want it to stop. I don't want anyone else to go through what I have. Absolutely, Principal Sanders replied. We have policies in place to address bullying. And I will personally investigate this matter. Thank you for trusting me with this information. As she left the principal's office, Lionel felt lighter. As if a burden had been lifted from her shoulders. She had taken a stand. Not just for herself, but for others who might be suffering in silence. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, confrontations with Sarah were still inevitable, but for the first time, she felt a sense of empowerment. The next day, rumors spread throughout the school about Principal Sanders' investigation into the bullying allegations. Sarah seemed to sense the shift, her usual bravado had cracked, replaced with an edge of defensiveness. As Lionel walked through the hallways, she noticed fewer jeers and more supportive nods from her peers. Some even whispered words of encouragement. But Sarah wasn't finished yet. After gym class, as Lionel walked toward her locker, she saw Sarah waiting for her, flanked by her friends. So, you went to the principal? Huh? Sarah said, her tone dripping with disdain. How pathetic can you get? Lionel stood her ground, her heart racing but her determination steady. I'm not afraid of you, Sarah. I did what I had to do to protect myself. Yeah, we'll see how that works out for you, Sarah retorted, a threatening edge to her voice. You think you're so tough now. But this isn't over. The bell rang, signaling the end of the day, and Lionel hurried to her next class. But the encounter lingered in her mind. She felt a mix of fear and adrenaline. But she refused to let it shake her resolve. She would stand strong against whatever Sarah threw at her. After school, Lionel met up with Mia, who had become a comforting presence amidst the chaos. They walked home together, and Lionel opened up about her fears. I just don't know what will happen next, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. Mia looked at her with empathy. You're doing the right thing. You can't let her control your life. You've already shown you're stronger than she thinks. As they approached Lionel's house, she felt a surge of gratitude for Mia's support. That evening, as she sat down for dinner with her family, she shared what had happened since her visit to Principal Sanders. James and Maria listened intently, their expressions a mix of pride and concern. We're so proud of you, Lionel, Maria said, her voice steady. You've taken a huge step. Just remember, we're here for you no matter what. Lionel smiled, the warmth of her parents' support enveloping her like a protective shield. Thank you, she replied, feeling stronger than she had in a long time. As the days passed, the investigation unfolded. Principal Sanders met with Sarah and her friends, and Lionel found herself filled with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. What would happen next? Would Sarah retaliate? But as she continued to focus on her studies and spend time with Mia, Lionel felt a growing sense of hope. She had taken control of her narrative, and though the road ahead remained uncertain, she was ready to face whatever came her way. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and she would not back down. Lionel was ready to reclaim her story, to fight for herself and for those who felt voiceless, determined to bring about change within Riverside Academy once and for all. The day had finally arrived. After weeks of tension, uncertainty, and courage, it was time for Lionel to face the culmination of her journey. The sun rose on a crisp Monday morning, illuminating Riverside Academy in a soft golden light. But Lionel felt a storm brewing inside her. Today, Principal Sanders would announce the findings of her investigation into the bullying allegations. And the weight of anticipation was nearly unbearable. As she walked through the familiar halls, Lionel felt the eyes of her classmates on her. A mix of curiosity and concern. Whispers floated around her. But instead of fear, she felt a newfound resolve. She had fought for her voice. And today, she was determined to make it heard. The first period passed slowly, the minutes dragging on as Lionel fidgeted in her seat, the weight of her decision heavy on her shoulders. She had spoken to Principal Sanders about the bullying. And now it was time for the rest of the school to know that they would no longer tolerate it. As the second bell rang, students began to file into the auditorium for the assembly. Lionel took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline pulse through her veins. She spotted Mia in the crowd, and their eyes met. Mia gave her a reassuring smile. And for a moment, Lionel felt a flicker of calm wash over her. Once everyone was settled, Principal Sanders took the stage, her presence commanding attention. The chatter subsided into an expectant silence as she began to speak. Thank you all for gathering today. We have some important matters to discuss regarding our school community and the values we uphold here at Riverside Academy. Lionna's heart raced as she listened intently. Her hands gripping the edge of her seat. Principal Sanders continued, her voice steady and firm. Recently, we've had reports of bullying and harassment affecting some of our students. We take these allegations very seriously and have conducted a thorough investigation into the incidents reported. Lionna could see Sarah sitting toward the back, her expression unreadable. But she felt a sense of determination rising within her. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The findings of this investigation revealed that there have indeed been instances of bullying taking place within our school community. Principal Sanders stated. And a murmur rippled through the crowd. This behavior is unacceptable and does not align with our core values of respect and support for one another. Lionna felt a wave of relief wash over her as the principal continued to speak about the importance of creating a safe environment for all students. The acknowledgement of her experience, of the pain she had endured, felt like a validation she had desperately needed. We will not tolerate bullying of any kind. And we are committed to implementing new policies to ensure that every student feels safe and supported here at Riverside Academy. This includes mandatory training for students and staff on recognizing and addressing bullying behaviors. The applause that erupted in the auditorium was deafening. A collective expression of support from the student body. Lionna's heart swelled, she could hardly believe the shift that was happening around her. Principal Sanders paused. And when she resumed speaking, her voice softened. I want to recognize one student in particular who has shown immense courage in standing up for herself and for others. Lionna Wilson. Thank you for speaking out and for inspiring us to create a better environment for everyone. Lionna's breath caught in her throat as all eyes turned to her. A mix of surprise and pride washed over her. And she felt the heat of blush creep across her cheeks. She stood up slowly, the weight of the moment sinking in. Applause filled the room. And for the first time, she felt truly seen. As she stepped forward, the fear that had once gripped her began to fade. Thank you, she said, her voice strong. I just want everyone to feel safe and accepted. No one should have to go through what I did. The sincerity in her words resonated deeply, echoing through the auditorium. After the assembly, students approached her in droves, congratulating her and offering their support. You were amazing, Mia exclaimed, beaming with pride. You really did it. Lionna felt a warmth spread through her as she engaged with her classmates, many of whom had shared their own experiences of feeling isolated or bullied. For the first time, she felt a sense of belonging, a connection with others who understood her struggles. But as the school day came to an end, the excitement began to wane, and Lionna found herself once again facing Sarah. The group of girls that had once tormented her gathered nearby, their expressions a mixture of anger and confusion. You think this makes you special? Sarah spat, her voice low. You think you can just turn everyone against me? Lionna met Sarah's gaze, her heart steady. This isn't about turning anyone against you. It's about standing up for what's right. You can change too. You know. It's not too late. The tension hung thick in the air. But instead of fear, Lionna felt an unexpected surge of compassion. Sarah's facade cracked for a moment, vulnerability flashing in her eyes. But it was quickly replaced by anger. Don't act like you're better than me, Sarah hissed before turning away, her friends following suit. As Lionna watched them leave, she felt a mix of emotions. She had stood up for herself and for others. And while Sarah might not change today, Lionna knew she had taken the first step toward a brighter future. That evening, as she sat down with her family, the conversation flowed more freely than it had in weeks. James and Maria were filled with pride, and Lionna shared the details of the assembly, her heart lightening with each word. You're truly a fighter, Lionna, James said, his voice filled with admiration. We're so proud of you. Lionna smiled, the warmth of her family's support wrapping around her like a cozy blanket. Thank you for believing in me, she replied, her heart swelling with gratitude. As she lay in bed that night, Lionna reflected on her journey. The road ahead was still uncertain, and there would be challenges to face. But she felt more empowered than ever. She had found her voice, reclaimed her story, and inspired others to do the same. With a renewed sense of purpose, she closed her eyes, ready to embrace the new beginning that lay ahead, a future filled with possibilities, hope, and the strength that comes from within. Tomorrow would be a new day, and she was ready to meet it head on, ready to forge a path of her own. As the days turned into weeks following the assembly, the atmosphere at Riverside Academy began to shift. The initiative led by Principal Sanders to combat bullying was making an impact, And Liana could feel the change as students rallied together to foster a more inclusive environment. In the wake of her confrontation with Sarah, Liana found herself at the center of a movement she had never anticipated. Students were discussing ways to promote kindness, support one another, and raise awareness about the effects of bullying. It felt like a wave of solidarity was sweeping through the school, and she was grateful to be a part of it. One afternoon, Mia approached Liana with a bright smile and an idea. "I've been thinking," she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "We should start a club. A safe space for students to talk about their experiences, support one another, and share their stories." Liana's heart raced at the thought. "You mean a support group?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Exactly." Mia nodded enthusiastically. "We could call it Voices United. It could be a place where anyone can come to share, to heal, and to learn how to stand up against bullying." The idea resonated deeply with Liana. She had fought hard for her voice, and the thought of helping others find theirs filled her with purpose. "I love it," she replied, her mind racing with possibilities. "Let's do it." The girls wasted no time, brainstorming ideas and gathering support from their peers. They created flyers and posters, spreading the word about the inaugural meeting of Voices United. Each day brought new excitement as students began to sign up, eager to be a part of the movement. On the day of the first meeting, Liana's nerves bubbled beneath the surface. She stood in front of the small group gathered in the library, her heart pounding. What if no one showed up? What if they didn't want to share? But as she looked around the room, she saw a mix of familiar faces and newcomers, each person carrying their own story. Mia stood beside her, offering silent encouragement, and Liana took a deep breath, ready to begin. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her stomach. "I know how hard it can be to talk about our experiences, but this is a safe space for all of us. We're here to support one another." As the meeting unfolded, students began to share their stories, some hesitant at first, but gradually finding the courage to open up. Each voice added depth to the conversation, revealing the struggles they faced, from bullying to feeling isolated and unheard. When it was Liana's turn, she felt a rush of vulnerability. "I want to share my experience," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "For a long time, I felt alone, like I didn't belong. I was bullied, and it hurt. But I learned that it's okay to stand up for yourself and to seek support." The room fell silent as her words hung in the air, the weight of her journey resonating with everyone present. She watched as heads nodded in understanding, empathy shining in their eyes. By the end of the meeting, a sense of camaraderie had developed among the group. They shared laughter, tears, and a collective realization that they were not alone in their struggles. Liana felt a warmth envelop her, the connection deepening with each shared experience. As the weeks went on, Voices United gained momentum. The club became a refuge for many, a place where students could express their feelings without judgment. Liana watched as the power of community transformed those around her, helping her peers find their strength and their voices. One afternoon, while wrapping up a meeting, Liana noticed Sarah standing at the door, her expression unreadable. The tension in the room thickened as students exchanged glances, unsure of how to react. "Can I talk to you, Liana?" Sarah said, her voice low but steady. Liana's heart raced. This was it, the moment she had both dreaded and anticipated. Sure," she replied, stepping away from the group. As they stepped into the hallway, Sarah crossed her arms, the defensiveness in her posture apparent. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry," she said, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I've been thinking about everything that happened, and I realize I was wrong." Liana felt a mix of surprise and skepticism. "You mean it?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Yeah," Sarah admitted, her bravado faltering. "I've been a jerk. I guess I thought that bullying would make me feel powerful, but it just made me feel weak. I see that now." Liana took a deep breath, grappling with her own emotions. "I appreciate your honesty, Sarah. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," she said slowly. "But it's important to understand that your actions affect others. We all deserve respect." Sarah nodded, her expression softening. "I know. I want to change. And I want to be better. Can you help me?" Liana hesitated, the sting of their past still fresh in her mind. But she also saw the potential for growth and transformation. "I think we all have the ability to change," she replied carefully. "But it's a journey. You'll need to show that you're committed to it." A small smile broke through Sarah's serious demeanor. "I can do that. I want to be a part of Voices United. I think I need it." With a nod of agreement, Liana felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Perhaps there was a way to bridge the gap between them. It wouldn't erase the past, but it could pave the way for a different future. As Sarah joined the next meeting of Voices United, the atmosphere was charged with uncertainty, but also with hope. Together, they shared their stories, and Liana felt the collective strength of the group grow stronger. Each voice mattered, and every experience added depth to their shared mission. In the following weeks, the club continued to flourish, and so did Liana. She embraced her role as a leader, encouraging others to find their voice while also recognizing the power of forgiveness. With each meeting, she felt herself transforming, reclaiming her narrative not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless. As the school year progressed, Riverside Academy began to evolve. The bullying policies were implemented, and students took an active role in fostering a culture of respect and kindness. Liana felt a sense of pride knowing she had played a part in that change. One afternoon, while reflecting on her journey, she realized how far she had come. The scared girl who once felt invisible had transformed into a young woman who embraced her strength and her purpose. With her friends by her side and a supportive community surrounding her, Liana was ready to face whatever came next. She understood that healing was a journey, one that continued beyond the walls of Riverside Academy. As she closed her eyes that night, she felt a profound sense of peace wash over her. She had found her voice, forged connections, and discovered the power of resilience. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to embrace them with open arms. The future was hers to shape, and she was determined to make it bright. As the school year drew to a close, Liana felt a whirlwind of emotions coursing through her. The halls of Riverside Academy, once a place of anxiety and fear, had transformed into a landscape of growth and support. Voices United had become a beacon for students seeking solace and strength, and Liana had taken on a leadership role that she had never envisioned for herself. The final meeting of the year was approaching, and Liana was both excited and anxious. She wanted to end the year on a high note, celebrating the progress they had made while also acknowledging the work still ahead. As she prepared for the meeting, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here, the struggles, the tears, the moments of doubt, and the victories that now felt so sweet. She remembered the timid girl who had walked through the school gates at the beginning of the year, uncertain of her place and fearful of the future. Now, she stood tall, ready to embrace her role in fostering change. On the day of the meeting, the atmosphere in the library buzzed with anticipation. Students filtered in, chatting excitedly, their faces glowing with the promise of summer. As the clock ticked closer to the start time, Liana felt her heart race with a mix of nerves and exhilaration. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady as she stood at the front of the room. "This meeting is special because we're not just reflecting on what we've accomplished, we're also looking forward to what comes next." The room filled with murmurs of agreement. She noticed Sarah sitting among the group, her expression one of determination. The transformation Sarah had undergone since joining Voices United had been remarkable. She had actively participated, sharing her experiences and working hard to earn the trust of her peers. "We've created a space where everyone can feel safe and supported," Liana continued, her eyes scanning the room. "But our work doesn't stop here. We have the power to keep this momentum going, to inspire others, and to ensure that Riverside Academy remains a welcoming environment for all students." The group nodded, and Liana could see the spark of commitment in their eyes. They had built something meaningful together, and the thought of continuing that legacy filled her with hope. As students began to share their experiences, the atmosphere shifted to one of reflection. Mia spoke about the impact of the club on her own life, how finding a voice had empowered her to stand up against her fears. Others chimed in, sharing stories of resilience, support, and newfound friendships. When it was Sarah's turn, she took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I just wanted to say thank you for accepting me," she said, her voice sincere. "I know I've made mistakes, and I've hurt people. Joining this group has shown me that I can change, and I'm committed to doing better." Liana felt a swell of pride as she listened. Sarah's honesty resonated deeply within the group, reinforcing the idea that everyone was capable of growth and transformation. They were all on their own journeys, and this club was a testament to the power of community. As the meeting continued, Liana introduced a new initiative, a summer program for students who wanted to keep the momentum of Voices United alive. "We can organize workshops, community service projects, and even mentorship programs for incoming students," she suggested, her excitement contagious. The students rallied around the idea, brainstorming plans and assigning roles, their enthusiasm filling the room. Lyanna felt a surge of hope as she watched her peers come together, united by a common purpose. They were no longer just survivors of bullying, they were advocates for change. When the meeting concluded, Lyanna lingered, taking a moment to soak in the atmosphere. It was a bittersweet feeling. The school year was coming to an end. But she knew that the bonds they had forged would carry on into the future. As she walked home that evening, the sun setting behind her, Lyanna reflected on how far she had come. She had faced her fears, reclaimed her voice, and become a beacon of strength for others. The journey had not been easy, but it had been worth every struggle. That night, as she lay in bed, Lyanna felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude wash over her. She thought about her parents and their unwavering support, Mia and the friendship that had blossomed, and even Sarah, whose journey had intertwined with her own in unexpected ways. But most importantly, she thought about herself, the girl who had once felt invisible and powerless, now transformed into a young woman who embraced her resilience. She had learned that it was okay to be vulnerable, to seek help, and to stand up for what was right. Lyanna closed her eyes, her heart full of hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, and she felt ready to meet them head-on. The future was bright, and she was determined to face it with courage and conviction. As she drifted off to sleep, Lyanna knew that this was not just the end of a school year, it was the beginning of a lifelong journey, a journey of advocacy, friendship, and the unwavering belief that together, they could create a world where every voice mattered.